Hi guys, in this video we're going to be learning about for loops. For loops enable us to repeat a process or an action multiple times. So let's start with an example. Let's say that we wanted to print out the numbers 1 to 10 in the console. I could do it like this, so I could have a system out print line statement with 1 and then duplicate the line using Command D on my keyboard and change these values, and this will print out 1 to 10 in the console. So if I run this application, you can see here that 1 to 10 has been printed out. Now, while this is perfectly valid, there is an easier way to do this, and that is using a for loop. We're doing the same action with different numbers, but essentially it is the same action. We're printing something out to the console. So let's create a for loop for it. I'm going to delete this code, and I'm going to start by typing for, and that's a Java reserved word. I'm going to declare a variable, int I equals 0, and I'm going to instantiate it with a value of 0. I is less than or equal to 10, semicolon, I plus plus. And at the end of it, curly brackets, and I'm going to change this actually to 1 instead of 0. And then I'm going to do s out. So this is the action that we're performing, and in there I'm simply going to type I. So what exactly does this mean? We have a for loop, and this is how we construct the for loop. So firstly, we start with a variable of I. We declare that variable and we instantiate it with a value of 1. This part of the for loop is the condition what must be met to run the next stage of the for loop. So it will run the content of this for loop, which is system out print line, with the value of I, which is initially set to 1, and this will only run if I is less than or equal to 10. And for every iteration of the for loop, we'll increment I by 1. And that's what the plus plus means here. It's exactly the same as writing I equals I plus 1. But it's just shorthand. So I plus plus. So the for loop will run. It'll instantiate I with a value of 1. And it will print out the value of I, which at the first iteration of the for loop is 1. It then goes back to the top. I now has a value of 2 because we incremented it by 1. So I is now 2. I is still less than 10. In other words, 2 is still less than or equal to 10. So it prints out the line. And without going through every single iteration, once we get to our last number 10, and we've printed out 10 here, it will go back up to the for loop. I will now have a value of 11 because we've incremented it by 1 right after we've printed out 10. And 11 is not less than or equal to 10. So the for loop essentially stops there because this condition is not met. So let's run the application and see what we get. And you can see we get exactly the same thing without duplicating this line 10 times. We've written the line once, we've used a for loop, and we've called it 10 times to print out the numbers 1 to 10. Now let's imagine that we only want to print out even numbers. And the way to do that is with an if statement within the for loop. So within the for loop, I'm going to say if I modulus 2 equals 0. Then we're going to print out the value. So we're still running through the for loop 10 times with 10 values, starting from 1 up to 10. With each iteration of the for loop, it will take that value of I and determine if it's an even number. And this is the calculation for checking if I is an even number. I modulus 2, so we're checking that it's divisible by 2 with no remainder. In other words, that is an even number. And we then print that value out. So let's run the application, and you can see here we've printed out 2, 4, 6, 8 and 10, all even numbers. Now let's delete these lines of code. So we just have our empty main method. For loops are quite frequently used with arrays, so let's create an int array. So we're going to declare an int array, and this is going to be student grades. And we're going to instantiate it with a set of values. So we'll have 10 student grades in here. 45, 67, 23, 92, 78, 67, 65, 43, 23, and 82. So we have our list, or our array of student grades, which is basically just a list of integers. And what we're going to do now is we're going to loop through the array, and with each value we're going to print out the grade, and next to it we're going to print out whether or not they've passed or failed. To pass, you need to score at least 70. So we can do that with a for loop and an if statement. So as we did before, we're going to start with for int I equals 0. So we're starting with 0 this time because we're working with arrays, and if we remember from the previous video, we said that arrays use 0-based indexing. If we remember from our previous video, arrays use 0-based indexing, so they start with an index of 0. We're going to say that so this is going to be our condition, so the for loop will only run as long as this condition is true. I must be less than student grades dot length. And dot length is the size of the array. I plus plus. So this is how much we increment the value of I on each iteration. In other words, we increment I by 1. And then within the for loop, we're going to say if student grades I is more than 70, or more than or equal to, so we'll say if they score 70 or above, then it will be a pass. Then we're going to print out grade plus student grades I plus, and we're going to just leave a hyphen and we're going to type passed. Else, we're going to system out print line grade, leave a space, concatenator, student grades I plus failed. So let's just quickly go over exactly what's happening here. On each iteration of the for loop, so we start with I equals 0, and we run the for loop as long as I is less than student grades.length. And on each iteration, we increment I by 1. So on the first iteration, I is 0. Student grades is our array here, and we're extracting the value from this array at index 0 because I is currently 0. That value is 45. 45, which will be the value that's now here, is not more than or equal to 70. So we go to the else part and we print out the grade and we print out failed at the end of that line. And we do that for each one until we get to our last one, which will be our 10th grade of 82. At this point, I will have a value of 9. 9 is less than student grades.length because 9 is less than 10. So it allows us to run the content of the for loop. This time, because it's 82, 82 is more than or equal to 70, so we print out the grade and we print out passed. And then on the next iteration, I is now 10. 10 is not less than student grades.length. Student grades.length is 10. So 10 is not less than 10. This resolves to false, so we don't continue with the for loop. And that is the end of the for loop at that point. So let's run this application. And you can see here that we've printed out all the grades, which are in the same order here, and we've printed out whether they failed or they've passed. Grades that have failed are less than 70, grades that have passed are more than 70. Now let's try creating an inner for loop. We have our for loop here, and what we're going to do is create another for loop inside that for loop, also known as an inner for loop. So right under this if-else statement here, I'm going to leave a line and I'm going to type out for int I equals 0, I is less than 3, I plus plus. And here I'm simply going to print out some star symbols. So what is this piece of code here going to do? Well, basically, between each grade, it's simply going to leave some space to make them a little bit easier to read. And it's a good way to simply show how we can use an inner for loop. So you might have noticed that we have a red underline for this value of I, and that's because we're already declaring a value of I here. So we need to fix that. We simply change it to something else. So I'm going to change it to J. I need to change this one and this one. Because of the fact that we've already used I here, and the fact that we're in the same scope, means that we can't use a value of I here. And we will talk about scope in a later video. So at this point of the code, we've already printed out the grade. Imagine we run our first iteration, it prints out a grade of 45, and right underneath that, we're going to print out 3 lines of star characters, simply as a buffer between each set of grades. And we're printing out 3 lines because we start with J equals 0, and loop through as long as the condition j is less than 3 is met. In other words, we're going to print out 3 lines. So let's run the application again, and you can see for each set of grades we print out 3 lines of star characters. What we can do to make this for loop a little bit easier to read is extract this logic into its own method and then simply call the method from within the for loop. So outside of the public static void main method, I'm going to create another method. Public static void create buffer. It doesn't need any parameters, and the method will simply create the 3 lines between each set of grades. So I'm going to remove this code, and on my keyboard it's Command X, which is the equivalent of cut, and I'm going to Command V or paste it into the create buffer method. And underneath the if-else statement, I'm simply going to type create buffer. It's only a small optimization, but we have a slightly smaller for loop where we perform the check of the student grade to determine whether or not we need to display pass or failed, and then we create our buffer, and our create buffer logic is within here. So if I run the application again, you'll see that nothing has changed. It's exactly the same. We've just extracted out the logic into its own method and called that method from within our outer for loop. One other thing to note here is because of the fact that we're only using this create buffer method within the application class, we can use private. And as we said before, private is an access modifier. We only require access within this class, so it makes sense to use it as a private method. And also note how we're using static. You have to use static in this particular case because of the fact that the method in which we're calling it is a static method. If this wasn't static, we wouldn't require static here. But since it is, and we're calling it from within this static method, create buffer must be static. So that's everything for this video. I really hope you found it useful. If you did, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe.